In September of 2015, a soft-spoken Canadian man in his 70s stood in front of a camera, picked up a black marker, and drew 2 lines on a whiteboard. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anyone. He smiled the way a patient grandfather smiles at a child who's struggling with a math problem. And then, calmly, he explained why a prophecy that had failed to come true for over 100 years had not actually failed at all. His name is David Splane. And to the millions of Jehovah's Witnesses watching that broadcast on their screens around the world, he was exactly what he appeared to be. A kind, gentle teacher, clearing up a confusing point of Scripture. But there is a reason it was him standing in front of that whiteboard, and not one of the other men who lead the organization. There's a reason that whenever the Watchtower needs to explain a doctrine that no longer adds up, or needs to warn 8 million people against the outside world, this particular man is so often the one they choose to send. Because long before he became the face of the hardest explanations in the religion, David Splane spent nearly half a century quietly becoming one of the most influential men inside it. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand something most witnesses have never stopped to ask. You'll understand how a boy who lost his mother before he could barely read grew up to be the man holding the pen that redraws the boundaries of the end of the world. You'll understand how a diagram on a whiteboard rescued a broken prophecy without ever admitting it was broken. And you'll understand why, in 2021, that same gentleman stood before millions and told them to stop trusting the news, stop trusting the courts, and stop trusting anyone outside the organization who tried to tell them the truth. This is not the story of a villain. It's something more useful than that. It's the story of how power actually works inside one of the most controlled religious organizations on earth, told through the life of the man who mastered it. Let's start at the beginning. Part 1. The Boy Who Learned to Speak. David Howard Splane was born in Calgary, in the province of Alberta, Canada, during the Second World War, around the year 1944. His path into the religion did not begin with him. It began with his mother. In the late 1940s, she encountered Jehovah's Witnesses, began studying the Bible with them, and was baptized in 1950. For a new convert, it should have been the start of a long life inside the faith. It wasn't. She died less than 2 years later. David was still a small child, too young to have known her for long, old enough to carry the absence. What happened next tells you something about how this organization works, and how early it begins working. After his mother's death, an older anointed woman from the congregation took an interest in the boy and invited him to keep coming to the meetings. He kept going. His father eventually began studying too, and was baptized. And so, from an age when most children are just learning to sound out words on a page, David Splane was already fully inside the world of the Kingdom Hall. The meetings, the routines, the expectations. Now, that detail is easy to skip past. Don't. Because the organization has a machine for producing the men it will one day depend on, and that machine starts with children. Inside every congregation there is a program called the Theocratic Ministry School. Its purpose is training. Training in public speaking, in constructing arguments, in standing in front of an audience and holding its attention without letting go. Members are assigned talks. They are critiqued. They are graded on their delivery, their reasoning, their poise. It is, in effect, a lifelong course in persuasion. David Splane entered that training as a boy. He began preaching from door to door before he was even a teenager, guided by older members who clearly saw something in him worth developing. And by the mid-1950s, still young, he was baptized, formally dedicating his life to the organization. So consider what was already being built. Before he had finished growing up, Splane had been handed the single most important skill of his entire future career. The ability to stand in front of a room and make a difficult idea sound simple, and make an uncertain idea sound certain. Hold on to that. Because 60 years later, that exact skill would be aimed at the single biggest problem the organization had ever faced. And what he did with it is the reason anyone outside the religion knows his name at all. But to get there, he first had to prove he could be trusted. And in this organization, trust is not given. It is earned, mile by mile. In September of 1963, David Splane took the step that separates the committed from the casual. He became a pioneer, a full-time preacher, dedicating the bulk of his waking hours to the ministry. Then came the assignment that marks a person as special. He was accepted into Gilead. If you didn't grow up in this world, that name means nothing. Inside it, it means everything. Gilead is the elite missionary school the Watchtower organization runs to train the people it intends to send to the ends of the earth. Not everyone is invited. Getting in is a signal that headquarters has noticed you and believes you are worth investing in. Splane graduated in the 42nd class of Gilead and was sent as a foreign missionary to Senegal in West Africa. Think about what that requires of a young man, to be dropped into a foreign country, a foreign culture, a foreign language, and to represent your organization there, alone, as its face. That is not a job for someone still finding his footing. It's a job for someone the organization has already decided it can rely on. When he came back to North America, he entered what witnesses call the circuit work, and he stayed in it for roughly 19 years. This is the traveling ministry. A circuit overseer moves from congregation to congregation, arriving as the visiting authority, inspecting how each one is run, correcting what's wrong, and delivering the featured talks. For about 14 of those years, Splane served in Quebec, the French-speaking heart of Canada, where he learned French and worked across a genuine cultural and linguistic divide. Now, stack up what those 2 decades actually did to him. 19 years of walking into rooms full of strangers and becoming, instantly, the voice of headquarters. 19 years of being watched by hundreds of congregations, of learning precisely how the organization sounds when it speaks, its cadence, its confidence, its certainty, and of learning to become that sound himself. You cannot buy that kind of training. You can only accumulate it, year after year, until it becomes second nature. Along the way, he became deeply involved in something most people would never guess mattered: the music. The kingdom songs, the hymns sung at every meeting and every convention, worldwide, passed in part through his hands. He helped shape and revise them. Think about what that means. The literal soundtrack of a witness's spiritual life, the melodies sung by millions in unison every single week, carried his fingerprints. That is not the resume of a background figure. That is a man being woven into the very fabric of the organization's daily experience. By 1989, all of it paid off. David and his wife, Linda, received the invitation that only a small fraction of witnesses will ever receive in their lives. They were called to Bethel, the world headquarters in the United States. Splane was placed in the service department, one of the central nerve centers from which headquarters exercises control over congregations all around the globe. Discipline, organization, oversight, the service department touches all of it. And then, in 1998, came the move that changed everything. He was made a helper to the writing committee. You have to understand what the writing department is to understand the weight of that. This is where the words are made. The magazines that land in millions of hands. The books studied at every meeting. The talks delivered at every convention. The doctrine itself, the very content of what a witness is required to believe, is produced here. A man who helps write what millions will read, study, and accept as truth from God is no longer merely a gifted teacher. He is standing directly beside the source of the message. He is inside the room where reality, for 8 million people, is defined. He was one step away from the top. And that final step was about to come as a surprise to everyone, including, quite possibly, him. On Saturday, October 2nd, 1999, more than 10,000 people, 10,594, to be exact, either present in person or connected by telephone tie line, gathered for the annual meeting of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania. These meetings follow a rhythm. Reports are read. Scriptures are considered. And then, that day, the meeting ended with what the organization itself openly called a surprise. 4 new men were being appointed to the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. Their names: Samuel Hurd, Stephen Lett, Guy Pearce, and David H. Splane. To grasp the magnitude of that moment, you have to understand what the governing body actually is. It is the ruling council of the entire religion. A small group of men, based at world headquarters, who formulate every doctrine, oversee the production of every publication, and direct the worldwide activity of every congregation on the planet. When they were appointed, Splane and the other 3 joined a body that had shrunk to just a handful of aging men. The decisions of that room reach into the home of every single witness on earth. But it goes deeper than administration, and this is the part outsiders often miss. Witnesses are taught that the governing body is part of the faithful and discreet slave, the channel that God himself uses to deliver spiritual truth to his people in these last days. Their teachings are not presented as the opinions of men. They are presented and received as guidance from God flowing through them. Which means that on that October afternoon in 1999, the boy from Calgary who had learned to speak in a kingdom hall, the missionary who had represented headquarters in Senegal, the traveling overseer who had become the voice of the organization across Canada, the writer who had moved into the room where doctrine is produced. That man had just become one of roughly a dozen human beings on the entire planet with the authority to define what 8 million people must accept as the will of God. He had reached the summit. There was nowhere higher to climb. But reaching the top is not what made David Splane's name. Reaching the top only put him in position. What made his name, what turned him from an anonymous council member into the man you're watching a documentary about right now, was the assignment that landed on his shoulders about a decade later. Because the organization was carrying a problem it had been running from for more than a century. A crack in the foundation that got wider every single year. And when the time came to plaster over that crack in front of the whole world, they didn't send just anyone. They sent David Splane. To understand why that assignment mattered so much, you have to understand the problem itself. And the problem has a date. The problem of 1914. 1914. If you want to understand Jehovah's Witnesses, you have to understand that number, because almost everything the religion teaches about the future hangs from it. Witnesses teach that in the year 1914, an invisible event took place in heaven. Jesus Christ was enthroned and began ruling as king, and that this same year marked the beginning of what the Bible calls the last days, the final stretch of history before God destroys the current world order at Armageddon and ushers in paradise. And to that date, the organization attached a promise, a specific, testable promise, drawn from the words of Jesus himself in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 34, "This generation will by no means pass away until all these things happen." The logic was clean and it was powerful. The generation of people who were alive in 1914, who saw the sign of Christ's invisible presence begin, would not completely die out before the end of the world arrived. The end would come within their lifetime. You cannot overstate what that promise did inside the religion. It was the engine of urgency. It was the reason young witnesses were discouraged, for decades, from pursuing higher education. Why waste years in university when the world was about to end? It was the reason members were urged to pour their time into preaching instead of building careers, into service instead of savings. The end was close. Not close in some vague poetic sense, close in terms of the human lifespan. Just years away. It was always just a few years away. But there was one force that no doctrine, no matter how firmly taught, could argue with. Time. The people who had been alive and aware in 1914 got old, and then they began to die. By the 1990s, almost none of them were left anywhere on Earth. The generation that had been promised, guaranteed, to still be around to see the end of the world was passing away, one funeral at a time. And the end had not come. Understand what that meant. This was not some obscure side teaching that a few scholars argued about. This was the beating heart of the organization's entire message of urgency, and it was dying in front of everyone. Every year that passed, every elderly witness who was buried without seeing Armageddon chipped away at the credibility of the central promise. The organization knew it, and it tried, repeatedly, to fix it. Over the decades, it quietly adjusted the definition of generation more than once. At one point, the generation was said to refer to the wicked people who would witness the end. Then that was changed. The interpretation shifted, and shifted again, each version an attempt to keep the promise alive without ever admitting that the original version had failed. But every fix kept slamming into the same wall. The people of 1914 were gone. The world was still here. And you cannot stretch a generation of human beings past the grave. They needed something new. Not just a new interpretation. They needed an interpretation elastic enough to stretch the promised decades into the future, and they needed it delivered by someone credible enough, calm enough, and trusted enough that millions of people would accept it without rebelling. They had exactly such a man. He had spent his whole life training for precisely this kind of moment. They sent David Splane. The seed of the new explanation first appeared in print in the Watchtower magazine of April 15, 2010. But an idea in a magazine is just words on a page. It needed a face. It needed a voice. It needed someone to stand up and make it feel true. That happened in a video presentation, broadcast to witnesses worldwide, with David Splane standing front and center, marker in hand, whiteboard behind him. And here is the redefinition he delivered, calmly and confidently. This generation, he explained, was never meant to be understood as a single generation at all. It was two overlapping groups of anointed Christians. The first group were those who were alive and spiritually aware when the sign of the last days became evident in 1914. The second group were anointed Christians whose lives overlapped with that first group, people who were alive at the same time as them, even briefly, and who would live on to witness the beginning of the Great Tribulation, the end. Picture the whiteboard. One line begins in 1914. A second line begins before that first line ends, overlapping it, and extends forward, reaching all the way into the present day. The generation, Splane explained, had not passed away. It had simply been passed, like a baton in a relay race, from the lives of the first group into the overlapping lives of the second. And to anchor this in Scripture, he reached far back, nearly 1,500 years before Jesus was even born, to the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 6, which mentions Joseph and his brothers and the generation that followed. A single verse, written a millennium and a half before the words of Jesus it was being used to interpret, applied now to solve a crisis in the 21st century. To a believing audience watching at home, it landed as relief. The prophecy hadn't failed after all. The gears fit together again. 1914 still mattered. The end was still close. They could exhale. But to critics, and to the growing number of members who were quietly beginning to question, it was something else entirely, and the objections were not hard to follow. First, it bent the ordinary meaning of a word past breaking. A generation, in any normal use of language, is the people living at one time. It is not two separate groups of people chained together across more than 100 years. If you can arbitrarily declare that a generation is actually two overlapping groups, critics asked, then why stop at two? Why not 3, or 4, or 5, stretching the deadline indefinitely into the future, forever? Second, the definition seemed engineered backward, built not from Scripture, but from the answer it needed to reach. Consider the strange result it produced. A person could have overlapped with someone from the 1914 generation for decades, could have known them, spoken with them, lived alongside them for 40 years, and still be excluded from this generation, simply based on the year they personally were anointed. The line wasn't drawn where the logic led. It was drawn wherever the organization needed it drawn to keep the promise breathing. For a great many former members, this was the exact moment the spell finally broke. And notice, it wasn't because Splane was aggressive or cruel. He was neither. It was because the calm, confident, grandfatherly delivery couldn't quite hide what the diagram was actually doing. Underneath the reassuring smile and the neat lines on the board, the presentation was performing a rescue operation on a deadline that had already come and gone. And here is the detail you should not miss, because it's the whole point. When the organization needed to defend this teaching before the entire world, it did not send its most forceful man. It did not send someone loud, or combative, or defensive. It sent its most reassuring one. A gentle teacher with a marker and a patient smile. That was the strategy. And it tells you precisely what David Splane's role inside the organization had become. He was the man you send when a difficult truth needs to feel calm. When something questionable needs to be made to sound settled. His decades of training, the boy who learned to speak, the missionary, the traveling voice of headquarters, had produced exactly the instrument the organization needed at exactly the moment it needed it. But if the whiteboard revealed how David Splane protected the organization's past, another appearance, a few years later, would reveal how he intended to protect its future. And this time, the target was not a date. It was information itself. By the beginning of the 2020s, the organization was facing a different kind of threat. Not an internal problem with its own math, but an external one that no whiteboard could solve. Information. For most of its history, the Watchtower organization had enjoyed something close to total control over what its members knew. If you wanted to hear a former member's story, you had to physically find one. If you wanted to read a criticism, you had to track down a book most witnesses were terrified to touch. The organization stood between its members and the outside world, and it controlled the gate. The internet tore that gate off its hinges. Suddenly, anything was findable. Former members, Some of them former elders, even former Bethel workers, could speak directly to millions on video. Court records were searchable in seconds. Investigative documentaries existed and circulated. National inquiries in multiple countries into how the organization handled the most serious allegations against it were reaching the general public. For the first time in the religion's history, an ordinary witness sitting in a meeting with a smartphone in their pocket could, in under a minute, find the exact questions the organization had spent a century keeping out of reach. The organization could not uninvent the internet, so it did the next best thing. It moved to make its members afraid to use it against the faith. And increasingly, the message from the top was blunt and direct: do not look. David Splane was among the voices delivering that message. Before a convention audience numbering in the millions, witnesses were urged to distrust news reporting about their organization, to distrust investigations into it, and, remarkably, to distrust even the decisions of secular courts when those decisions went against the group. Seeking out such information was framed not as reasonable curiosity, but as something spiritually dangerous. A trap. Inside the religion, there is a standard image used for this kind of material. The reports, the testimonies, the criticisms produced by those who have left. It is likened to poisoned food, or to food pulled out of the garbage, something a healthy person should feel instinctive disgust toward, and would never dream of putting in their mouth. That is the emotional response members are trained to have toward outside information. Not curiosity, but revulsion. Now step back and see the full shape of it. Here was a man whose entire lifetime of influence had been built on explaining things. 60 years of standing in front of audiences and making ideas clear. And that very authority, the trusted voice, the patient teacher, was now being used to explain to people why they should stop seeking explanations from anyone but him and the handful of men seated beside him. For many who watched from the outside, that convention message was the clearest expression yet of a single, coherent strategy. Because think about what it accomplishes. If the organization is the only voice a member is permitted to trust, then the organization can never be contradicted. Not by a journalist with documents. Not by a court with a verdict. Not by a former friend with a story. Not even by the passage of time and a prophecy that never arrived. Control the sources of information, and you control the conclusions. A member who has been taught to feel disgust at the very idea of checking will never check. And a person who never checks can be told, calmly and confidently, almost anything at all. That is the deeper thread that connects the whiteboard to the warning. Both were, at their core, about protecting the organization from scrutiny. One from the scrutiny of the calendar, the other from the scrutiny of the outside world. And both were entrusted to the same reassuring man. So let's assemble the whole picture, because only when you see it all at once does the real meaning emerge. A boy loses his mother and is drawn into a kingdom hall in Canada, where he learns, from childhood, to stand up and speak with confidence. A young man carries that skill into the mission field of Senegal, and then into 19 years as the traveling voice of headquarters across Canada. A trusted servant is called to world headquarters and placed, first, in the department that controls congregations, and then in the department that writes the words. And finally, he is lifted into the tiny circle of men who decide what 8 million people must accept as the truth of God. At every single stage of that climb, David Splane's value to the organization was the same one thing. He could make ideas sound certain. He could take something shaky and make it feel solid. And so, when the organization's central promise about the end of the world finally collided head-on with reality, he was the natural choice to stand before the camera and calmly redraw the timeline. And when the organization needed its members to stop listening to the outside world, he was a natural choice to explain, gently, why that silence was actually a form of faithfulness. And this is why it would be a mistake, a lazy mistake, to simply call him a villain and move on. That's not what this story shows, and it's not the point. The point is influence, and how it accumulates. Because when you trace this man's career honestly, from the orphaned boy to the elder statesman with a marker, you stop seeing a simple biography of a kind old teacher. You start seeing something far more revealing. You start seeing a working demonstration of how power is actually built inside this organization. It is not seized in a dramatic moment. There is no coup, no power grab, no single decisive act. It is earned, quietly, across decades, through loyalty, through usefulness, through being the reliable voice again and again and again, until one day, one man's marker on a whiteboard can move the boundary of the apocalypse for 8 million people. Until one man's voice at a convention can teach those same 8 million that curiosity itself is a spiritual danger. That is what David Splane's rise reveals. Not the story of one unusually persuasive man, but the anatomy of control itself. David Splane's story, in the end, is not really about a Canadian who happened to be good with a microphone. It's about how a modern religious organization defends its promises when time refuses to cooperate, and how carefully, how deliberately, it chooses the face that delivers the news. Not the angriest face in the room. Not the most aggressive. The calmest one. The most trustworthy one. The one you'd let sit at your kitchen table. That is the face the organization puts in front of the camera when it has something difficult to sell. The overlapping generations diagram is still taught to this day. The warnings against outside information have not softened. They have only grown louder as the internet has grown harder to escape. And the overwhelming majority of witnesses who sat through those presentations, who nodded along at the whiteboard and absorbed the warning about the news, never once stopped to ask the single question this entire story raises. So let me leave that question with you. When the explanation for why a prophecy did not fail comes from the very same men who taught you that prophecy in the first place, and when those same men also instruct you that you are forbidden to check anywhere else, that outside information is poison, that the courts and the journalists and the ones who left are all to be distrusted, then how, exactly, would you ever be able to find out if they were wrong? That is the position millions of people are in right now. And they were guided into it, calmly, patiently, by men who never once had to raise their voice. If this look inside the men who quietly shape what millions believe was worth your time, subscribe, because we are working our way through the entire governing body, one man at a time, and some of the stories still ahead are ones the organization would much rather you never heard. Tell me in the comments which member you want investigated next. And if you know someone who spent years of their life waiting for a promise that kept quietly moving further away, share this with them. They may recognize far more of this story than you'd expect.